So there'll be a couple more people coming in during this talk, but one of the things that really drew my attention to the subject of this conversation is a letter written by Xi Jinping and his administration to celebrate his visit to Nepal in October of 2019. And this appeared in the Xinhua News right before Xi Jinping landed in Kathmandu. And one paragraph especially drew my attention because I think it really draws on the elements of Chindia that will be displayed for the rest of this talk. For this paragraph, Xi Jinping states, China and Nepal are close neighbors linked by the same mountains and rivers and enjoy a long-standing friendship. More than 1,600 years ago, the Chinese and Nepali monks Fasyan and Buddhabhadra visited each other's countries and together translated Buddhist scriptures into Chinese. Their translation works have remained influential to this day. In China's Tang Dynasty, Nepali princess Rikuti was married to Tibetan king Songtsen Gampo, while the Chinese monk Xuanzang visited Lumbini, the birthplace of the Buddha, and left many precious written accounts of his pilgrimage. Then in the Yuan dynasty, Arniko, the renowned Nepali architect, led a group of artisans to China and presided over the construction of the White Stupa at the Miaoying Temple in Beijing, among several magnificent structures over the country. These are but a few examples of our past interactions that have inspired a lasting friendship between our peoples. Now, of course, when I saw Xi Jinping drawing attention to these moments of alleged Nepali-Chinese exchange, it immediately made me draw my eyebrow because at the same time, Nepal didn't exist as a state during any of these moments that Xi Jinping cites. Many of the examples that were illustrated here were instances of interactions between typically the Tang Dynasty, Yuan dynasties, and the Lichavi dynasty, which was in the area of Kathmandu at the time during the 7th century, and then also the Malla dynasty, which was in the Kathmandu Valley at the time during the Yuan. And many of these polities didn't really have as clear boundaries as we associate with today in South Asia. So it was very hard for even the Chinese visitors to distinguish where one polity in the Indian subcontinent began and where the next one ended. So I think what Xi is trying to emphasize here, despite knowing all too well that Nepal wasn't established until the 18th century, was that this is a whole vision for establishing a thousands of years worth of friendships along a Chindia vision for geo-civilizational unity, particularly between India and China, but as I will argue later, also between these other neighboring states who had similar characteristics and were also very instrumental in this long-standing relationship. And as I said before, because this is the 70th anniversary of the PRC and Republic of India's relations, I thought this would be an appropriate talk to discuss. And at the same time, because of widespread concerns about the novel coronavirus, these kinds of tensions will also have impact on some of the connections that create the friendly relationships that Xi Jinping asserts. But before I actually get to the PowerPoint, I just wanted to enumerate a couple of different projects that, of course, most people know about the Belt and Road Initiative, and it's also very apparent in South Asia, even though much of the emphasis tends to be on African states and Eastern European states. And this was one of the chapters that was published by Pakistani academics to talk about the Belt and Road Initiative from a business perspective. And as you can see, it's detailing all the major projects throughout South Asian countries. For Pakistan, you have at least $11 billion worth of road projects. You have special economic zones, the Gwadar East Bay Expressway, which is on the coast, and at the same time, you have new projects in the pipeline for a dry port, for an international airport, and you have fiber optic cable construction to allow better internet access. And these are just a few of those. And if we go on to the next page, it also talks about neighboring states that have less of a close tie to the Belt and Road Initiative as Pakistan, but still have substantial projects. Of course, with Sri Lanka, there's a lot of news surrounding the Hambantota port, which many people consider to be a debt trap and has created a lot of problems for the government in paying back the Chinese, and in terms of how long should you be loaning parts of your territories to China. And then, of course, with Nepal, a lot of these projects are more recent than Pakistan. Most notably, China's trying to create a railway that will go up to the Nepal border and hopefully one day go up to Kathmandu and into northeast India. At the same time, you have a construction of a major international airport that's about an hour or two's drive from Kathmandu to the west. And these kinds of airports are a significant deal for Nepal, because if anyone has flown into Kathmandu, there's a significant issue with capacity and trying to accommodate all the flights, especially with the increased amount of tourism to Nepal, which is a big initiative of their government to try to encourage Chinese tourists and tourists from the west, and of course the people who want to climb Mount Everest from the Nepal side. At the same time, you also have fiber optic cables that are going from Tibet Autonomous Region up into Nepal as well. At the same time, you have other states that have significant projects, but noticeably absent is India, which has nothing on this list. But that isn't to say there aren't forums that incorporate multilateralism into a China, India, and other emerging powers dialogues. Particularly, you have the BRICS, and then you have the economic corridor that incorporates Bangladesh, Myanmar, and also different states in northeastern India to create a regional dialogue about various issues. And this is another way that China hopes to advance this interconnectivity, particularly through the railroad system. So I hope that this kind of discussion will encourage people to talk about the entire different questions raised in this forum, particularly what current states should be included in the Chindia vision. And I'll talk more about this question in detail, as well as what is Chindia and how do we even conceptualize it. And also, what do the results of Xi Jinping's tour demonstrate about the trajectory to Chindia? I think over the couple of decades, it has been seen as just a straight trajectory between China and India, just as states. But more recently, it seems that Xi Jinping has also tried to emphasize an approach of going around through its neighbors. At the other end, it's to what extent do India-Pakistan tensions hinder Chindia's relation? Obviously, in Jammu and Kashmir, which has areas that China has also laid claim to in a smaller part, but also have exacerbated by advancing the China-Pakistan economic corridor in some parts of this region. And lastly, to what extent does Tibetan migration hinder Chindia's realization? Tibet, as I will explain, has played a big role in the tensions between China and India, and in previous years with Nepal as well. But unfortunately, there have been inroads made in trying to curb Tibetan migration, and Nepal, for the most part, has cooperated, as we shall see. So we need to start by defining Chindia, and this leads to the very immediate problem of trying to understand, who should be included, who should be the ones to advance a Chindia vision. How is Chindia achieved? But this was actually a very new concept. It was first created by Jairam Ramesh in 2005 with his book, Making Sense of Chindia. Now, Jairam Ramesh does not have experience with China in terms of a diplomatic capacity. He's mostly served as a parliamentary official for two different states in the southern end of India, and at the same time, he is somebody who is more styles himself closer to Nehru, which is a very traditional style of economic development in terms of Indian political philosophy. At the same time, as historian Tansen Sen outlined in his book, India, China, and the World, this kind of book was lacking a conceptualization of Chindia and was more so emphasizing this utopian 2,000 plus years of peaceful relations that, as we will see, has been fraught with some instances of conflict, but at the same time, it's something that many people seem to emphasize the peaceful relationships, but do not and try to resolve the more contentious issues, particularly those that have emerged since the 19th century. At the same time, you have a Chinese proponent of the Chindia philosophy, particularly Chan Cheng, who is the son of Tan Yunshan, who was a director of the China Bhavana Institute in Bolpur in northeast India, which was a very significant institute for Chinese Indian studies, particularly in the 20th century. And basically, he also propped up Jairam Ramesh's ideas and trying to emphasize a civilizational friendship. But the problem with Tan Chung, despite being a prominent scholar of Chinese studies in very prominent Indian academic institutions, is that he is somebody who has spent much more of his later years in India as an Indian citizen. Many of the people in China, while they do want to emphasize this friendship, as we saw with Xi Jinping's letter, there are still many different issues with why trying to bring that into fruition is difficult. And I think it's much more easier for a scholar like Tan Chung to assert a Chindia identity when he spent most of his life in the academic realm of India itself, especially in areas that have emphasized a China-India geo-civilizational unity. So the important thing is to go back a little bit and see where Chindia drew inspiration, especially because the concept only emerged in 2005. And of course, the first instances of this, well, at least in terms of academic discussion, was in the early 20th century with Okakura Kakuzo, who was a Japanese scholar who first coined the phrase Pan-Asianism. But of course, there were many other people in their accounts of Chinese-Indian discourse in the 19th century who had brought up these kinds of relationships. But this scholar was the first to emphasize India and China as these great foundational civilizations. But the issue with his kinds of dialogue was that most of the time he was bringing this up as a way to show that Japan, as an empire in the early 20th century, has taken up the mantle of where India and China have failed because of the colonial invasions. So already this relationship was very fraught, and many Indian and Chinese scholars had problems getting behind Kakuzo's Pan-Asianist vision, especially during World War II. But even prior to then, there were important visions from Liang Qichao and Rabindranath Tagore in establishing various institutions to study these relationships going back 2,000 years, especially with what I said before, China Bhavana, which is in Bolpur. It's a very long historical institution that has received many prominent officials such as Chiang Kai-shek, Nehru, Zhou Enlai, so many different famous figures throughout the 20th century. At the same time, even after World War II, you have a very coordinated attempt to try to improve relations between China and India after the Second World War, particularly with the Asian Relations Conference in India itself. But as I will explain, this also had some issues with trying to identify what are the Asian states that should be coming together, particularly Tibet. And then at the same time, even when the PRC was established, Nehru was initially very adamant about continuing the relationship with the PRC, and that's why they were one of the earliest Asian states to acknowledge the PRC as the legitimate government of China in 1950, so 70 years ago. But the issue that immediately started to appear in the first decade of PRC India relations is that you have questions over Tibet's sovereign status and territorial status. And of course, these areas, these were questions way before the PRC was established. I mean, even during the Asian Relations Conference, you have various officials from the Kuomintang trying to argue with the hosts in India as to why a map shows Tibet's boundaries clearly separate from China. And so these were many different issues that had come up, and people were frequently arguing about how this should be resolved. And even though there was a treaty signed in 1955 between the PRC and the Republic of India saying, okay, we acknowledge that Tibet is part of China. And so even though that happened, of course, other events, as I will show later on, exacerbated those tensions. But along with that, you also have the People's Liberation Army starting skirmishes in disputed territory in the 1960s, eventually leading to the Sino-Indian War. And you even, during that time, have famous figures like Mao Zedong questioning this friendly relationship, where Mao Zedong said that there were actually 1.5 wars before this Sino-Indian War. And what he was referring to was a war between the Tang Dynasty and a polity very close to the border with Nepal in the 7th century. And then he said a half war because the famous Turk Timur had invaded the Delhi Sultanate in the 14th century. And so Mao Zedong had thought that Timur was Mongol, and because many parts of Inner Mongolia and even Mongolia at the time were a part of China, he believed this to be part of the whole kind of Pan-Asianist vision, and also to emphasize China's very vague territories at the time. But of course, Timur was actually Turkish, so even historian Tansen Sen pointed out that there were even 2 more conflicts, one between the Han Dynasty and a polity in what is now Kashmir and Afghanistan. And then there was evidence that the famous Admiral Zheng He during the Ming Dynasty carried out a conflict on the Malabar coast towards the end of his voyages in 1433. So there were even a lot more that even Mao Zedong had expected initially. And then it's also important that throughout these kind of conflicts, Nepal, while staying very neutral and very careful not to try to exacerbate these tensions, Nepal was very much giving these kinds of assistance to the Indian military, particularly through its elite warriors, the Gorkhas, which had long been in the British Army, and then once India declared independence, they were parts of the Indian Army. And China knew that this was happening all too well, but Nepal was still very careful to just assert their neutrality, and at the same time accepting Tibetan migrants who were fleeing from China in 1959 and onwards. And for a decade, they were allowing Tibetans to just come in almost freely up until the 1970s. And lastly, India not being involved in the Belt and Road Initiative today shows that these kinds of tensions still exist to an extent. Now there's a couple of images here that help better conceptualize what Chindia is. And of course, many people like to posit the Buddhist connections. And of course, there are different areas in Nepal that have in many ways preserved this kind of tradition of Buddhism, particularly Tibetans, Newars, and also various other cultures that identify as Buddhist. But at the same time, it's also important that Nepal has emphasized its Indian identity. Even well after the Mughal dynasty had conquered most of the Indian subcontinent, the Nepali state in the 18th and 19th centuries were trying to assert their identity as the last Hindu monarchy. And in all intents and purposes, that was true. And I think because they're asserting that identity, they're trying to establish themselves in this whole grand Pan-Asianist Chindia vision about maintaining these connections that were started when different monks came over from the early 200 CE onwards. In the top right, you also have partition, which of course it's easy to see why someone may argue that Pakistan and Bangladesh should be a part of this kind of Chindia vision, because they were part of the British Empire for many years, and even before then they were part of these very undefined polities that were all over the Indian subcontinent and in different ways interacted with Chinese travelers and even the Admiral Zheng He. And this is even true for places that were unaffected, like Nepal and Sri Lanka, but they were still very important in creating these ties. Of course, I've talked a little bit about the voyages of Zheng He and his different actions on both Sri Lanka, the Malabar coast, but even where these lines aren't drawn, it's especially in northeastern India, you have different areas, especially in West Bengal and what is now Bangladesh, where these polities were very much interacting with Zheng He and trying to use the power of the Chinese Navy at the time as sort of a bargaining chip to assert their own power in the Indian subcontinent. And then, of course, lastly, this is one of the economic corridors that I talked about before between China and India. It is the BCIM economic corridor, which stands for Bangladesh, China, India, and Myanmar. Although not much has gone into fruition, the hope is that their first project will be trying to establish a railway link that will eventually go up into Kunming. But so far, it's just been mostly holding forums and even holding a coordinated drive across these several countries. Now, before I actually get into this tour, it's important to understand a little bit about where these leaders and their political parties come from, particularly with the three states in this tour, Pakistan, Nepal, and India. Now, with Pakistan, you have the famous politician and former cricket superstar Imran Khan from the Tehreek Party of Pakistan, and this party is definitely more assertive of relations with China. It has been more assertive of establishing relations with its neighbors, and at the same time trying to create a more peaceful settlement with India in terms of Jammu and Kashmir. But unfortunately, because of the recent crackdowns in Jammu and the revocation of its status as a semi-autonomous state, unfortunately, Pakistan's party is having a little bit of trouble. But they are definitely more moderate than some of the more conservative parties that even go into radicalism and terrorism, many of which are large issues between India and China, and also to Nepal to an extent. Now on the right, you have Kagda Prasad Oli, who is a very prominent politician in Nepali politics. He is a member of the Unified Communist Party, which is a combination of the Maoists that had caused a major civil war for 10 years back in the 90s and early 2000s, and it's also the United Marxist-Leninists. Now this party is very favorable towards engagement with China, more so than any of its other parties, but that isn't to say the other parties there are against it. But recently this party has almost established a mandate in the country by winning elections to a resounding success and having the majority in most of the legislative assemblies in both the national and in provincial governments. And so typically what is happening with Oli and Xi is that this is being given a blank check to just advance all sorts of agreements with China. And of course, this creates some tensions with India, as I'll explain later. And then of course, at the bottom, instead of showing you a picture, I thought I'd show you a short video instead. But of course, with Modi and the BJP, in India, you have more of a nonpartisan suspicion towards China, because of the Sino-Indian War and because of major mutual suspicions since then, and a unwillingness to resolve major issues of contention, particularly in Kashmir, and then also because of Tibetan migration. So even though the BJP is a relative newcomer to the China-India relations compared to the Congress party, they still have many of the same suspicions that go back to the Sino-Indian War and maybe even before, depending on what their experience with Tibet was. So during this tour, I thought it would be a little bit fun to show one of the greatest displays of pageantry.
Right. And these are very special beacons in their touch of this time. Silk and gold image of President.
It's a little bit hard to see, but it's an image of Xi Jinping's head. Yes. So just from this alone, you would expect this to be the most productive visit, but ironically, this was the least productive compared to Pakistan and Nepal, which actually advanced aspects of the Belt and Road Initiative. But here it was mostly just pageantry. But of course, given that this is the 70th anniversary, there is hope that there will be better relations this year and better discussions over the next few months.
They gave the she straw, and then she gives the plate.
So just before I get to the different areas of the tour, it's important to talk about a little bit of the tensions that we have between Pakistan, China, Nepal, India. Of course, with Pakistan, there's always a question of, with all of the different Uyghurs sent into re-education camps, if this creates tensions between Pakistan. But so far, I really struggle to find moments where Imran Khan has criticized these mass roundups of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. At the same time, there are different issues in terms of the failure to resolve the China-Pakistan economic corridor, in terms of whether these different projects will lead to a huge debt trap for Pakistan, and especially on the Gwadar port along the coast. And more recently, the novel coronavirus, because there's a lot of Chinese laborers and Chinese project managers who need to come in for this kind of development in both Pakistan and Nepal. And it's hard to say how much this virus and its spread will impact these kinds of migrations, especially for a state-to-state basis, but also on a more local basis, where individual projects might be delayed in their construction because they're concerned about bringing in laborers who have been in contact with infected persons. And of course, with Pakistan, India, there isn't much reason to go into the source of their tensions. Of course, Kashmir continues to be an area of contention. There's also issues with terrorism, with radical political parties that try to advance a anti-India agenda. Thankfully, Imran Khan does not represent those kind of parties, but there's always that fear. And then with Nepal and Pakistan, Nepal serving as a haven for this kind of Islamic radical activity, because there are Muslims in Nepal, just to a smaller extent, and at the same time they are they're usually very hidden, and it's easy for people to go in and out of Nepal undetected. And this is even a bigger concern for Pakistan's Secret Service and India, because there have been covert operations carried out by the ISI from Pakistan that have ultimately inflicted damage or harm on the Indian subcontinent. And then of course with India, as I talked before, Tibetan migration, it actually should be 93,000 in terms of the amount of Tibetans that are in India. This is according to the Tibet Central Administration in India. And then at the same time, there are one-sided suspicions about since the Sino-Indian War. I say one-sided because I think most Chinese people don't tend to have a very strong opinion about the Sino-Indian War, especially when they have all these other instances more recently of Xi Jinping and Modi coming together and having all these displays of pageantry. But many Indians remember that time all too well, and it caused a great panic, especially in Calcutta and other major cities along the border with China, especially because the PLA was making successful invasion into territory, and then suddenly they decided to withdraw. So they could have advanced further, but they didn't. But nonetheless, many Indians remember that time all too well. And then, of course, many of these other things I've just talked about with Pakistan and China's areas of contention. It's also important to notice with Nepal and India, you have water resource management, especially with the Himalayas on Nepal-China's border. You have a very difficult time trying to manage water resources in the terms of hydroelectric power, which causes a lot of tensions between the states that are neighboring Nepal and then almost all of Nepal itself, because Nepal has long wanted to harness these river systems and create hydroelectric power plants, and so far China has made the most successful inroads in promising it that kind of energy. But of course, that creates problems with India, because in the past, India has been the one to develop those kinds of plants, especially in the 90s and early 2000s. And then for the Madesi people between Nepal and India, the Madesis are people who are of North Indian heritage, and this actually led to a very serious instance in 2015-2016, where you have the Madesi people claiming that their new constitution does not represent them in Nepal. They create a bunch of riots, and the Indian government says, well, unfortunately we can't really send our fuel trucks into Nepal because of all these protests. And Nepal just thinks they're doing it out of solidarity with the Indian people. So unfortunately, this creates a whole conflict that leads to very difficult relations between both India and Nepal. And China actually intervened in this case in 2016 by offering to accommodate 1/3 of the fuel that they lost because of these massive protests along the Nepal-India border. And then this is mostly going through everything I just said, but actually it shouldn't be 20,000, it should be 13,000, which is the third largest country with Tibetans in the entire world. So for the tour itself, she visited India and Nepal in that order, and right before then, Imran Khan came to visit Xi, Li Keqiang, and all of the major leadership in Beijing in October 8th. But it's important to also note that for the visit to Nepal, that this was the first visit by a major Chinese head of state to Nepal since 1996. And that was very much because of the civil war between the Nepali monarchy at the time and the Maoists, which caused a lot of infrastructural disruption, instability in terms of tourism and official visits. So the fact that Xi Jinping came in October of 2019 is a very big deal, not just for the Nepali people and how far they've come in terms of all the strife since then, but also for the Nepal Communist Party, because it shows that they're the first party to create a stable enough circumstance for Xi Jinping to visit. So for the initial visit by Imran Khan to Beijing, there was a joint press release issued by the Pakistan Ministry of Foreign Affairs and then China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And there were two things to note especially. The fact that Jammu and Kashmir was an issue that China is trying to take a step back from and trying to let it be an issue that India and Pakistan resolve. And I think for them, they're trying to do this to try to broaden the sense of friendship between the different states of the Indian subcontinent and themselves. At the same time, you have the agreement to go to the second phase of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which is more of an emphasis on agriculture, fiber optic cables and internet capabilities, technology advancement, and social economic circumstances, as opposed to the first phase, which was more an emphasis on roads and energy. But this is more of a map of the first phase, and as you can see at the way bottom, there's the Gwadar port that also has been granted various facilities as a result of this visit to further develop it. But there's also concerns that this port puts the Pakistan government in great debt to China. And then, of course, you have the very illustrious visit to Chennai, where Modi and Xi had many different photo ops, and they visited the temple of Malarapuram, which is a very famous temple from the early 600s, 800s CE, which was a very instrumental time during the different polities on the southeastern part of India that often traded with southeastern China and Southeast Asian states. So Modi and Xi were very aware of these kinds of connections that were being propagated during this visit. And even though this was really an informal summit and there weren't a lot of agreements made, there's of course hope that there is more discussion, especially in regards to Kashmir, and then also in regards to India's trade deficit with China, which is also massive despite tensions in recent years. Now the last one, in my opinion, had the most amount of agreements made, and these are just a few, especially the ones that were emphasized in the joint statement. You have a feasibility study that was agreed upon for a cross-border railway, presumably one that would hopefully go from Lhasa all the way into Kathmandu and eventually end up in northern India. So far, it's just between Lhasa and Jirong in the Tibet Autonomous Region, so there hasn't been made a lot of inroads in Nepal so far. You have different economic corridors throughout Nepal along the same lines as Pakistan, only of course because there's no sea, you have to have different dry ports. Also, what I thought was interesting is agreeing to open Chinese banks in Nepal and offering financial services. I even once read a report just 2 weeks ago that Nepal is trying to allow WeChat Pay to work in the country. And so it's very fascinating how all of these different agreements are made, and China is really making an effort to make it more accessible, not just for the Chinese laborers and project managers who work on these projects in Nepal in great number, but also for the tourists who have steadily increased, although hopefully the coronavirus will not impact that as much. And then of course you have agreements to build a university in Nepal, the Madan Bandari University, which presumably will be in Kathmandu, and it's named after a famous Communist Party of Nepal official from the early 90s. And it's really interesting just trying to see all of these things that have been advanced. And I just want to emphasize that in this picture, Oli is standing right here, and she is standing with the president of Nepal, Banjari, who is also an official of the Communist Party and the first female head of state for Nepal, although she does not have as much administrative and foreign policy power as Oli himself, but she's also acted as Minister of Defense and many other prominent positions. So I think for her, it's also very significant to be meeting with Xi and also being at the forefront of these historic relations. Now to address the elephant in the room. So just a little background for anyone who's unfamiliar with the situation in Tibet. So basically the Tibetan migration starts with a very massive wave of migrants in 1959 because at 1950 the PLA had officially entered Tibet, though they were claiming to liberate it and also create better development and economic situation for the Tibetan people. And this led to a lot of disillusionment among the Tibetan populace. There was a major revolt, which unfortunately was not as successful as they had hoped. And so in 1959, you have the Dalai Lama fleeing with a large group of Tibetans to particularly India, but also to Nepal as well. And it's important to understand that the reason for this migration is because it's been going on for many centuries. I mean, even in the case of my girlfriend, she talks about her grandfather making frequent visits to Lhasa before the PLA ultimately shut down that trade. At the same time, when the Dalai Lama fled to Tibet, you also have the Nepali monarchy initially agreeing to allow these refugees in and just turning a blind eye despite Chinese protests. And that was up until 1971 because the US CIA was supporting Tibetan missions to go into China and start rebellions. And these were very strong Khampa fighters who were very skilled in the terrain of Tibet. But eventually, because Nepal was trying to create better relations with China, and also because they were tired of basically a base of Tibetans operating in their own country, they decided in 1971 to stop these covert operations and surround the base. And even the Dalai Lama had asked them to just lay down their arms and not put up a fight against the Nepali forces. And so, for the most part, Tibetan refugees, while they still have come and gone throughout Nepal and India, they have essentially been stateless. They don't really have a way to acquire citizenship, and at the same time, the Nepali government, even to this day, is not a signatory of the UN Convention on Refugees. Ironically, China is. So at the same time, you have all of these instances where Tibetans are trying to vie for citizenship, and Nepal is, especially under the Communist Party's leadership in their own government, is really turning a blind eye to these requests and really turning towards better relations with China for the purposes of their own country's development. And so even in 2008, there were famous instances of Tibetan protests. This is one such instance outside of the Chinese embassy in Kathmandu, where you have the Nepali police arresting the Tibetan monks who were protesting. But there were many other protests besides this. But 2008 happened to be a famous instance, obviously because of the Beijing Olympics. So in terms of how this came into play during Xi's visit, the government was positing a Nepal-China extradition treaty, and according to the joint statement issued by both governments, at the very end it says, both sides also were satisfied with signing the treaty on mutual legal assistance in criminal matters and expressed hope for an early conclusion of the treaty on extradition. So that kind of verbiage led almost everyone to believe that this extradition treaty was ultimately not signed. And it's also important to mention that Tibetans weren't explicitly mentioned as a reason for curbing this. Now, there's a couple reasons for this. Of course, China likes to put forward curbing anti-China activities, which, although most of the time they do refer to Tibetans implicitly, they still also refer to other instances. There have been Han Chinese criminals who have hidden in Nepal, and then they've actually had to ask the Nepali government's assistance for trying to locate them. These are usually people who are guilty of cyber crimes or other kinds of instances of corruption or fraud. At the same time, you have the circumstance where, although India and Nepal have their own extradition treaty from decades ago, there has been a crucial update that has been put forward since 2006, given all the advancements in technology and cybercrime, but the Nepal government has not approved this treaty. So many sources in the Kathmandu press, particularly the Kathmandu Post, the Himalayan Times, a lot of them think the reason why this extradition treaty didn't go through was because this treaty was still pending with India and Nepal. It was not out of solidarity with the Tibetans, although there were certainly activists who were calling attention to it in Kathmandu. I think ultimately the government was concerned that they need to prioritize this India-Nepal extradition treaty that's been on the table for many years before they consider a China-Nepal. However, a recent article in what I like to think of as an unsubstantiated source claims the opposite. So it says, this issue came to the forefront after Minister of Foreign Affairs Pradeep Jawali, offering a written clarification to the members of parliament in Nepal, has affirmed that Nepal and China have signed an agreement to hand over the people targeting Tibetans entering each other's borders without documents within 7 days of being taken under custody. However, this article, well, of course it has appeared in Tibet activist websites and things like that. I have not been able to locate it in the main sources of the Nepali press, such as the Kathmandu Post, the Himalayan Times, and other sources that are in the Kathmandu area. But this released in January of 2020, about 3 weeks ago, and so I'm very confused as to what was the reason for this clarification, and how come even China on their Ministry of Foreign Affairs page has not made any clarification or any kind of similar acknowledgement of this treaty being signed, because even in their joint press release, as we just saw, they talked about this extradition treaty. They were not trying to keep this a secret agreement during Xi's visit. So while we still have a couple of minutes, I wanted to return to the idea of a Chindia vision, and especially the idea of what current states should be included in the Chindia vision. Now, my feeling is that China, India, Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh should all be included. And for Nepal and Sri Lanka, those ones are a little more debatable than, say, Pakistan or Bangladesh, which were part of the British colonial empire's territory, at least for the Indian subcontinent. With Sri Lanka, you also have the Buddhist connections that were also very fundamental in fostering India-China connections. You also have Nepal that has a lot of this influence as well. At the same time, they've also asserted a Hindu identity in terms of their former monarchy, which when the Mughal Empire had taken over most of the Indian subcontinent, it created a haven for devout Hindus to flee to at the time during the 16th and 17th centuries. Of course, there is also debates as to whether former states should be included in this kind of Chindia vision. For example, states that used to belong to the boundaries of Chinese dynasties, such as Vietnam, the Koreas, Mongolia, and you also have some argument for Tibet as well, whether this should be an important part given all the tensions that the Tibet situation has caused. And then what did the results of Xi's tour demonstrate about the trajectory to Chindia? Now, of course, there is still many tensions that have hampered the overall trajectory to a very friendly India-China relationship. But I think what Xi is trying to emphasize is to go at it from India's neighbors. Now, of course, going through Pakistan isn't going to make a lot of inroads in fostering a friendly relationship. But I think going through Nepal certainly will, especially given that India and Nepal have by far much more friendlier relations over the 20th and 19th century compared to Pakistan and India just in the past couple of decades alone. And seeing as Nepal is making inroads with China, that might be more of an encouragement for India to do the same this year. At the same time, for India and Pakistan, I feel that China is being very careful about the whole Kashmir situation as it stands, and they're trying not to exacerbate their feeling of a friendly relationship between all the South Asian states. And even though, of course, the economic corridor development in Pakistan threatens to hurt those kinds of feelings, at the same time, you still have people going ahead with trying to plan all the pageantries and conferences and summits of the different kinds of events for the 70th anniversary celebration. And so lastly, Tibetan migration, over the past few decades, if we had this discussion before this visit, I would say that this kind of migration is a big detriment to Chindia's vision, given all the tensions it's created over the past couple of years. And then at the same time, even nowadays though, you still have different areas where Xi is trying to get Nepal to cooperate on Tibetan migration, for example, by presumably handing over Tibetan migrants who enter into Nepal illegally as a result of an extradition treaty. Whether it's actually been signed or not, we still have yet to see. But these are my different arguments to this Chindia vision, and I'd certainly welcome your ideas about this, given this historic year and the amount of controversies that have emerged that threaten to exacerbate these feelings of thousands of years worth of friendship. Yes, Rob.
Yeah, thanks for this. It's really interesting. There was a book a few years ago by Andrew Small called The China-Pakistan Axis, I think. It's basically unpacking this little understood all-weather friendship, as they call it, between China and Pakistan and its implications for South Asia and the region. And I wonder if you can maybe just say a little bit more about this, your third bullet point here, because it seems like this is an issue where it's sort of not an issue until it is, right? Like, China's all-weather friendship with Pakistan hasn't, to date, jeopardized in a fundamental way its relationship with India, but do you have, is the point you're making that you have some confidence that it won't going forward either, because you don't see that, you see them sort of finding a way to make sure it doesn't go off the rails, or you see them finding a way to not have to choose? Or is it that, I mean, sort of, I guess, like, what's your theory of stability there? That's my basic question.
Right. So I do have confidence that going forward, this will at least not present an issue for China in terms of having to choose between one power or the other. I think especially during these various summits and even more official meetings, Xi Jinping and the other Chinese leadership that has made limited inroads in India and more so in Pakistan, I think they've been very careful about not creating a huge conflagration by picking a side and saying who has ultimate authority over the issue, but also when these tensions do arise, as we have seen during the same time when she was visiting, and all of these revocations of autonomous status in Kashmir by the Indian government and other issues, I think she was very careful about playing it safe and not trying to make a big mess out of things. However, we have yet to see how this second phase will play out in Pakistan's Belt and Road development, especially because there could be projects or the presence of more Chinese laborers and project managers in disputed territories in Jammu, Kashmir, and even elsewhere in border areas. And so this could be a possible detriment, but so far I think China has been much safer there than as opposed to, for example, the Doklam standoff right between Bhutan and Nepal, where even though that was just a one-sided attempt to construct a road into what is considered to be Bhutan's territory by the Indian government, it created a 74-day standoff. But thankfully, even the BRICS forum that was meeting just a few weeks later, that played a decisive role in eventually calling off that kind of standoff. So every now and then we see instances of these multilateral forums encouraging these kinds of resolutions. But at the same time, I acknowledge that sometimes these resolutions are not always permanent, and they can still exist well into the future. Any other thoughts?
A couple on the sort of framing of the 1,000-year friendship, right? I mean, so it seems to me the story that you're telling about Nepal is really similar to the sort of same story that China tells about Tibet, right? And specifically sort of the Princess Putri, right? Who, along with the Chinese princess, are both also incarnations of the Terras, right? So she's considered an incarnation of the Green Terra, right? And the Chinese princess is considered an incarnation of the White Terra, which is to say that there's this huge, extremely important religious overtone of this conversation, right? I mean, that's, as I'm saying, it's a historical figure, but they're also the Virgin Mary, right? So there's a big claim about, I think, religion and what it means to be a society baked into that, right? That this is formational to Tibet specifically because it sets the tone for what is going to be their culture in terms of religion from the Nepalese side, and then ideas about government and law from the Chinese side, right? So that's like a really, you know, I mean, that's a story that China tells a lot, I think, now about Tibet, right? Where you can say, like, yeah, you know, you have special characteristics, but also remember there's this Chinese influence and it all kind of works, right? And so my other second quick thought is that, you know, thinking about this sort of history of Tibet as a military power, or looking at this history of skirmishes, right? I think is something not to discount from the Chinese side. And the reason I say that is, you know, keep in mind, during this, you know, the 8th century, you know, Tang incursion, fair point, you know, the borders of Tibet are not drawn, but they were certainly ethnically Tibetans, and they conquered Chang'an. Like, this wasn't a minor thing. You know, I mean, this was, the Chinese capital fell to these people, right? You know, I mean, you know, through the mid-Qing, you know, the Tibetans had, you know, influence and vassal relationships with, you know, sort of many of the various, like, Mongolian powers, including the Dzungars that the Qing lead an extermination campaign against, right? This isn't, I think the last 150 years or so of looking at this as a military power largely imposing itself in a non-military power is not totally right, and I don't think it's totally psychically right from the Chinese point of view, right? I'm not saying you're saying this per se, but I'm saying that there's kind of a point to the people that are cherry picking the good stories here and not the more confrontational stories, right? So those are just scattered thoughts, but I do think it was very interesting, this framing, right? Things that are kind of cited and things that are not, right, by some of your historical actors.
Well, those are still very essential points that you put forward, especially because with Tibet you have various instances of these kinds of traders and different circulations of routes into the Indian subcontinent. And I think trying to interpret these things, it's very easy to try to assert the areas of friendship, given that China and India have had a colonial embarrassment period that they like to draw attention to. And I think in these kinds of ways, it's also important to look at the ways that various Tibetans view these moments of history that have helped bring these civilizations more together, at least on a rhetoric basis, for those that try to propagate this theory. But at the same time, I think that the idea of a Chindia vision also, which I haven't even got to at this presentation, is that it also ignores the participation of mediaries going in and facilitating these connections, particularly from Uzbekistan with the Sogdian traders, and then also from various South Asian states that had much influence on the circulation of ideas into Southeast China, at least over the past millennium. So I think looking at these kind of perspectives from their angle as well would also be very crucial. The Tibetans, the various people are in and around Uzbekistan, and also from Malaysia and Indonesia, because anytime that India and China has come together to research these connections, like they did it famously in 2010 when they made an encyclopedia, they only had Chinese and Indian scholars. They didn't open it up to any other scholars, and I'm sure especially Pakistan would have liked to be involved in that, but at the same time I'm sure that there were Tibetan scholars who felt excluded in that history as well. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I thought it was a very impressive command of a great deal of information in your presentation, and very articulately expressed. To follow on Richard's question, so if I understand, an issue is, you could say that you could have a slide on, is why is Tibet such a problem? given, when you look at the bigger picture of the geography and stuff, and population and economic factors, it's relatively small in this big picture. Yet it looms large, clearly, in your presentation, so that's just a suggestion, I think is what Richard's sort of getting at. Is
Yeah, I think
Okay.
exactly that.
the
Historical
broader
framing.
analytic
You're thinking
why.
about a place that's frankly scarce in resources, right? I mean, it has a low population for most of, the last 500 years. I mean, there's a huge point in sort of early modern history where it's just very scarcely inhabited. What we think of now is Tibet, not Greater Tibet, not Shanghai and Sichuan. But yeah, I think Bruce is right, and I think the last thing I'll tag on to your point about the atlas is don't be fooled by Chinese historiography that asserts a very Han-centered version of history, right? I mean, keep in mind that, the Qing Empire was a Manchu dynasty, right? That many modern Chinese historians, now will tell you, well, yeah, they were Sinicized, and yes, the Qing emperors were doing these Tibetan rituals, and yes, they practiced these things, but that was a way of placating the Tibetans and the Mongolians and keeping kind of nominal rulership over those lands. Is that true? I don't think so. I mean, I think that many of, especially the early Qing emperors, were sincere in their beliefs. I think that they came from nomadic societies that practiced, very specific kinds of Tibetan Buddhism, right? I mean, and this is the case we see in Mongolia now, right? Mongolians all have Tibetan names, right? This is a huge world of influence that doesn't disappear overnight, right? And so I think too, you can have Chinese Indians, and you can still have inaccuracies about the China side, even, right? So you're on the right track,
Yeah,
I think, for sure.
Yeah, that is an important point, that's especially from both of you, because I was trying to figure out how to, to what extent should I go far back into Tibetan connections with these kinds of relationships, and especially because a lot of this is centered around the Sino-Indian War of 1962. I think that created some limitation in itself, but at the same time, it is important to consider this from the other perspectives of various of not just Tibetans, Mongolians who have those cultures, but in the area, but also in terms of the various experiences of the Nepali people who have trade and helped to facilitate those connections. And had we had more time, I felt like I would go in greater depth about those more historical connections than just up to the 19th and 20th century, which admittedly does create a more limited view about how these connections are fostered and why it creates a more complex image of the Chindia vision.
We're at 10:06, so.
All right, thank you very much, Dan.
Thank
Anyone
you.
wants to stay and chat, you're welcome to. We have the